So do please have your Bibles open if you have them, or church Bibles, on page 1021, if you're using those. Well, it's Journey to King's Cross, and this morning we are looking at Jesus on trial. Justice is something that's very important to us, isn't it? And as we come to these last two chapters of Mark's Gospel, or 2.5 chapters or so, we realise that we're looking very closely at Christ's life, and we are seeing a man under intense pressure. I guess for some people, when you put someone under pressure, they want to see what happens when you squeeze, do the pips squeak? You know that phrase? And sometimes you put people under pressure and they begin to react irrationally, or they begin to show fear, or whatever it is they show under pressure. We are watching Christ under intense pressure, and we're going to see not a single flaw, not a single weakness that emerges. He is perfect to the last, under the most extreme circumstances. But at the same time, what we realise when we're looking at Christ here under this pressure, we are seeing that mirror reflection, aren't we, of ourselves. We are seeing here a searching examination of the human race. And this morning, the human race in its claim to administer justice. One of our deepest desires, isn't it, justice? Justice for the 96. I saw even this week there was something on the news about this. These are the people, 96 people died at Hillsborough in 1989. 34 years ago almost, in that Hillsborough Stadium disaster. And still today, people are demanding justice for 96. In fact, someone's died since then. It's now 97, but someone, I think was in a coma, has died subsequently. It's now 97. Justice, of course, you've heard this one, justice for George Floyd as well, who was beaten to death in America by some policemen. Justice for Harry Dunn, who was killed in, I think it was Oxfordshire, on his motorcycle by a lady who was an American woman from the American Air Base there, driving on the wrong side of the road. Justice for Harry. Justice for Sarah Everards. You remember her, of course, brutally abducted and murdered by Wayne Couzens. Justice for Johnny Depp. Okay. Justice, most recently, of course, for Tyree Nichols, another American, brutally beaten and then murdered, or died of his wounds in America. We demand justice, don't we? We want justice. Very deep in the human soul is this cry, as these people here cried out, justice, I want justice, but not for myself, but for someone else. And when it is performed, justice at its best, doesn't it delight us? Doesn't it ennoble us? Don't we feel good when we see justice administered as it ought to be? Doesn't it inspire us and also awe us when that sword is delivered and justice is seen to be done? But I suspect more often our experience is the opposite, isn't it? More often we feel let down, we feel saddened, embittered at the lack of justice. And here in Mark 14 we are going to witness a gross perversion of justice. Justice perverted. Jesus is brought before a court. But it isn't just any court, is it? We're told in verse 53 that this court comprises the high priest and all the chief priests, the elders and teachers of the law as they come together. This is the Sanhedrin, we're told in verse 55. The highest court in Judaism. It's the Old Bailey of Israel in Old Testament times, indeed also in New Testament times as well. And these officials that are mentioned in verse 53 are the guardians and custodians of God's law. God, who is the very fount of justice, the one in whom justice lies, the one who has given us in his image that desire for justice. He has entrusted his law to these people. And that law included the 10 Commandments. And of course the 9th one, you remember, was about law court, wasn't it? You shall not bear false witness against your neighbour. So God, who is the source of all justice, has told Israel they are to reflect this justice to the nations. When they're to go into the promised land, God says this: observe my laws carefully, for this will show your wisdom and understanding to the nations. So one of the ways, in fact, I think it's the main way that Israel was to be a witness to other nations about God, was in the way they administered justice. People would look at them and say, well, what wisdom is in this nation? What incredible good laws they have, what fair laws, what justice. And they would want to come to that same God themselves who has given them these laws. Therefore, the highest standards of justice were demanded of Israel. We read in Deuteronomy, choose judges who will judge fairly. Do not pervert justice or show partiality. Do not accept a bribe. Follow justice and justice alone. They are told that if they have a case brought before them, they must thoroughly investigate and come down hard on anyone who gives false testimony in their courts of law. Because God says in Isaiah, the Lord is a God of justice. For I, the Lord, love justice. Do you see how important it is for Israel to observe justice and to actually reflect that to those around them? And here, in these verses, we see this court, the highest court of Israel, Sanhedrin, bringing the Son of God to trial and putting him in the dock. How bizarre that they should do that. Those who've been entrusted with justice, putting in the dock the one who actually is the origin of justice. If they thought about it, wow, what are we doing here in the first place? But worse still, of course, they pervert justice. Look at verse 55. The chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus so that they could put him to death. There's no impartiality here, is it? They've decided on this sentence beforehand. They're looking for evidence to back that up. That isn't impartiality, is it? They've come with their fixed minds. This guy is going to be killed. We're going to execute him. Let's find a reason for it. They break, by the way, their own rules. They had rules, this is not in Scripture particularly, but they had their own rules about justice, that when they were going to try someone for their lives, trials had to be in daytime. And this is in night time, isn't it? So they've broken their own rules as well. They accept false and unreliable testimony in verse 56. Many testified falsely against him, but their statements do not agree. The best they can do is in verse 58. They have some people who stood up and gave this false testimony against him. We heard him say, I will destroy this man-made temple, and in 3 days will build another, not made by man. A cobbled together hearsay. It's certainly true. You go back to Mark 13, that when the disciples had praised the temple before Jesus, he had said, well, actually, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Not by himself. It was the Romans who would do that in AD 70. And it's true also that in John chapter 2, we can see that he was speaking to the Jews and said, destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. The temple he was talking about was his body. And he didn't say that he would destroy the temple. He says, you destroy this temple. In other words, they were going to kill him. Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days. So it's a mishmash, isn't it, what they come up with here in verse 58. And it is not, it's not reliable evidence at all. The fact is that as they go through this trial, there is no sufficient evidence to convict him of this capital crime. Verse 55, at the end of that verse, we see this statement. They did not find any. They were looking for the evidence against Jesus to put him to death, but they did not find any. Nothing sufficient to warrant the death penalty. Jesus, of course, is silent the whole time, as we sang in that last hymn, fulfilling the scriptures as the sheep before her shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. He has no need to answer these false charges, and in fact his silence speaks more, doesn't it, about the falsity of the charges than about his own culpability, which is not there. The high priest, it seems, is getting desperate. He realises he is about to lose his case unless he can come up with some sort of trump card. And he does in verse 61. He stands up in verse 60 and asks Jesus, are you not going to answer? He's trying to put him under pressure here. Come on, I want to hear you say something. I want to convict you of something. What is this testimony that these men are bringing against you? Of course, it's false testimony. He didn't give an answer to it. Jesus remained silent and gave no answer. So here we have, here's the joker. Here is his best card he can play. Here is his last desperate attempt to convict Jesus. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? The Christ is the Messiah, but more than that, he's saying, are you also the Son of the Blessed One? That is the Son of God. And if in the New Testament or Old Testament thinking, if you said you were the Son of God, that was in effect saying that you were God, because to be the son of someone was to have the same nature as someone else. My son has the same genetic nature as I do. He comes from my body. He is like me. He's a human being. He has that same makeup as I do. Christ is being asked here, are you the Son of the Blessed One? Do you have the same nature as God? Do you claim to be divine? I am, said Jesus. And you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven. And the high priest tears his clothes. Why do we need any more witnesses? I've got it. I've managed to get from this man this admission. You have heard the blasphemy, he says. What do you think? And they all condemned him as worthy of death. The high priest assumes blasphemy. And yet in the Old Testament they are told to carefully investigate. Where is there any careful investigation? If this man is the Messiah and the Son of God, how will they know? He's on trial here for that, but without any examination of that, with any careful investigation, the high priest assumes that this man has committed blasphemy, because he simply assumes, being impartial, or being partial rather, that this cannot be the case. He has prejudged him, that he is not the Messiah or the Son of God. And by the way, when he tears his clothes there, when he hears these words, the high priest tore his clothes, that also is forbidden in Leviticus. The high priest was not to do this. So again, he's breaking his own laws there, the laws that God had given them in the Old Testament. So justice here is being badly perverted. Why didn't Jesus remain silent again? He was silent all through his trial up to this point, all the false charges, but now he isn't. Now he speaks. He has chosen to give the high priest the evidence that the high priest wanted to have him executed. I am, said Jesus. And of course that is the name that Yahweh gave to Moses in the Old Testament so that they would know who the true God was. Tell the Israelites, I am, has sent you to them. God tells Moses. And here is Jesus saying, I am. Declaring in effect that he is Yahweh. Identifying himself with the God who led Moses and the Israelites out of Egypt. Some people claim today, and some respectable academics claim, that Jesus never said he was God. He never claimed to be God. And it's true that up to this point in Mark's Gospel, he has kept his identity hidden for much of the time. Although you can deduce it, of course, from what he says and his miracles, and work out, as Peter did, of course, that you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. But that was something that Peter declared, not that Jesus declared. Jesus made it clear, made it possible for them to work that out, to deduce it, but he never openly declared himself until now to be the Son of God. Probably because he wanted to avoid premature arrest. But now that he's on trial, and now that his hour has come, he leaves no room for doubt in anyone's minds. As he says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven, which of course is the prophecy that was given to Daniel. And we remember also, of course, that Daniel, chapter 7, is all about justice. It's about the court being seated And before it is able to give its verdict, the Son of Man comes on the scene as the judge. When Jesus speaks these words, he's giving the high priest, the chief priest, and all the others with him, a picture of himself as the judge. Do you see the irony here? He's turned things around completely and said, actually, I'm going to come as the judge, and you will be the ones who will bow down to me and will come under my judgment. It's a supreme irony, isn't it, here? These words of Jesus. That actually, you're going to see in the future, the whole thing is going to be turned around completely opposite what it is at this moment. How terrifying, if they took him seriously, how terrifying for them to realise that here is a man prophesying their own judgment, their own eternal judgment before the court of God, when the Son of Man comes again as judge of the living and the dead. Justice, Jesus says, is coming when I return. And then we see in these last two verses from this section, justice deserved. What happens here? They all condemned him as worthy of death. Then some began to spit at him. They blindfolded him. They struck him with their fists and said, prophesy. And the guards took him and beat him. Do you know, from the Garden of Eden onwards, we, you and I, the human race, has been at war with God. When Adam and Eve fell in the garden, their first reaction was to hide and find excuses and lay the blame somewhere else. Didn't seem that serious at the time, a bit trivial really, and just hid their nakedness, of course. But actually, as we go on through the scriptures, we realise that actually there's a deadly game going on here, and the reality of our rebellion is now laid bare in these two verses. It's like a game of cards, a game of poker perhaps, if you ever played poker, and it's coming to the climax. And these two poker players, God and man, are playing their last cards. The high priest tries in his desperate appeal to make Jesus condemn himself. Are you the Christ? Are you the Son of the Blessed One? And he thinks, I've got him, and he's admitted to it. Christ puts his cards on the table. I am, he says. And here you have the human race on one side and God on the other, putting their cards on the table. And the human race thinks, we've got him. We can nail him up to the cross now. He has admitted blasphemy. Isn't it all very similar to what we heard only 2 chapters earlier when Jesus told the parable of the tenants in the vineyard? Remember the tenants in the vineyard? They didn't want to give the fruit, did they, to the owner of the vineyard or a share of the crop. And they beat some of the messengers who were sent to collect the fruit from them. And they treated them shamefully. And then finally they said, when he sent the heir, which is Christ, of course, here is the heir. If we kill him, we'll have it all to ourselves. Then we can be complete owners of the vineyard without anyone to answer to. That's what's happening here, isn't it? The tenants are saying, here's someone, if we get rid of him, we'll have it all to ourselves. This actually is spiritual reality. When everything is laid bare, when the final cards are played in his hands, this is what we see. Man and God at war with each other, and man determined to destroy God. You know, when we meet people on the doors with Mark Perkins, or maybe when you meet people and talk to them about faith, they may politely decline our invitations and say, no, it's not really something that interests me at all at this moment at any rate. But in reality, here is the reality, they hate God. And they want him out of their lives. This is what happens when the final cards are played. They condemn him as worthy of death. They spit at him, they blindfold him, strike him with their fists and say, prophesy. And they take him, the guards take him and beat him as well. Do you know, justice for Jesus is what we want, isn't it, at this point? Justice for Jesus. How dare they treat him like that? You know, in that parable about the tenants in the vineyard, in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus asks this question at this point. You know, therefore he says, when the owner of the vineyard comes, what will he do with those tenants? The people listening said, well, we want justice for the owner. And they say, he will bring those wretches to a wretched end and rent the vineyard to some other tenants who will give him his share of the crop in season. So the people listening to the parable say, yes, we want justice for that owner. But that isn't what happens, is it? The judge instead submits to injustice. It's all so wrong, isn't it? The one who has the right to judge us, the one who should be in the place of the judge, is on the end of appalling injustice. Instinctively, we want to see justice done, don't we? But rather than summon 12 legions of angels to his rescue and to reverse the roles and put us in the dock and him in the judgment seat where we belong, the judge willingly submits to this kangaroo court. No one takes my life from me, said Jesus, but I lay it down of my own accord. In Isaiah, as I prophesied about this, I offered my back to those who beat me, my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I did not hide my face from mocking and spitting. Why does the judge submit this? Why doesn't he call for justice for Jesus at this point and reverse the roles? Because God, in his love for us, is going to perform for our sakes the greatest act of justice ever. He's going to cause all his holy anger, the verdict that should be against us, that is waiting for that court in Daniel, as the court is seated and the books are opened and it's clear there that we are guilty. And this man comes in and says, wait, hold the courts, and takes our place there, and all God's holy anger and our behaviour is visited on him, on Christ, the one who is without sin. And we receive his righteousness. We are pronounced innocent, free of any charge, released from the dock. God presented Christ as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in his blood. He did this to demonstrate his justice, so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. That's a justice that I can barely comprehend. Do you comprehend that this morning? That God has performed an act of justice that goes way beyond what we think would be fair. What would be fair is for us to be put in the dock and be punished. And the sinless one is put in our place. What does this mean for us then? First of all, that court is sitting. The court date is fixed. It was there in Daniel 7. It's there again in Acts 17 and verse 31. God has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. The Son of Man will come on the clouds and will take his place on that seat. Christ will return as the judge of the living and the dead. How will you fare on that day when every knee shall bow, some unwillingly, but some willingly? Have you received the offer of justice that God is giving us here, ahead of that terrible day, that dreadful day when it comes? So that we actually are pardoned, we are set free. We are those who, when that great day comes and the judge sits, will be counted as righteous because of the blood of Christ. So many people refuse this offer, don't they? Are you among those people who so far have said, no, I'll have my day in court, I think I'm good enough. I'll justify myself there, I'll argue my case to God, I'll tell him all the good things I've done. Tell him how fair I've been in this world, how I've given my, like perhaps like Bill Gates, given my wealth to the poor. He's a lot of it, not all of it, but some of it. I'll justify myself. I think I'm good enough. Or will you accept that actually there's nothing that can pay for your sin, for your guilt in that court except the blood of Christ? And have you accepted that in your life? Has it paid for your sin? We implore you on Christ's behalf, says Paul, be reconciled to God. God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of Christ. Has that happened in your life? The court date is fixed. We have an opportunity to be counted guiltless on that day, to be pronounced innocent. But if we don't take the offer now, it may never come again. We implore you on Christ's behalf, be reconciled to God. Please, even today, do that before the time runs out. And then secondly and lastly, as Christians, we should never welcome injustice, we should protest against it. As Paul did on occasions when he was arrested and at one point he's about to be tortured, and he asks the centurion about to torture him, is it right? Are you allowed? Is it just to punish a Roman citizen in this way without trial? But nor should we expect that we will receive justice. Before Parliament at the moment there is a conversion therapy ban being put forward, which may well ban Christians from praying for people who ask for help with unwanted same-sex attraction. There are people campaigning quite strongly that we should be banned from praying for those people. If that happens, are we going to stop praying for them if they ask for prayer? If they ask for help? I would hope not. We may be on the wrong side of the law. We may be arrested. We may be put in prison or put in the dock ourselves. When that happens, if that happens, remember these words from 1 Peter chapter 2. To this you are called, says Peter, that is suffering, because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When they hurled their insults at him, he did not retaliate. When he suffered, he made no threats. Instead, he entrusted himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, so that we might die to sins and live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were like sheep going astray, but now you have returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. We are to be like Christ. We are to recognise that we may suffer in this world. The courts of this land may well find us guilty, but we have one judge before whom we will stand eventually. And it's to him that we look. And it's before him that we want to stand and be tried and found not guilty. Because as Christians we say, actually, we trust in him. He will vindicate us because of Christ. And that will be our testimony to those who have yet to believe. As it was here. I wonder how many of these people who are watching this trial, people like Nicodemus, thinking very deeply about this. And recognising maybe years later, this was a righteous man. This was the Son of God who had come for him. So let our justice, let the way we behave, be a testimony to the world about the justice that God will bring on this world one day.